Every week, Surfing the MASH Tsunami brings you major stories from the world of steatotic liver disease. This week, the entire episode is a roundtable focused on a major news story, the approval of Semaglutide for the treatment of non-cirrhotic MASH, making it the second approved agent in the U.S. and pushing MASH therapy onto a whole new exciting plateau.
For the last 5 years, MASLD stakeholders, whether manufacturers, trial sites, providers, payers, patients, or investors, have turned to Surfing the MASH Tsunami to keep track of drug and device development, epidemiology, public health initiatives, and practice patterns. This weekend, we have divided our special episode on semaglutide's approval in the U.S. into 3 chapters so you can listen to each one over a shorter, discrete period of time. We hope you enjoy them.
Surfing the MASH Tsunami is sponsored by these healthcare-related organizations.
Regeneron is a leading biotechnology company that invents, develops, and commercializes life-transforming medicines for serious diseases. Founded and led by physician scientists, their unique ability to repeatedly translate science into medicine has led to numerous approved treatments and product candidates in development, most of which were homegrown in their laboratories. They are shaping the next frontier of medicine with data-powered insights from the Regeneron Genetics Center and pioneering genetic medicine platforms, enabling them to identify innovative targets and complementary approaches to potentially treat diseases like obesity and MASH.
LiverRight and the LiverRight Scanning Network. LiverRight is America's first virtual specialty clinic for liver disease, offering adults in all 50 states video appointments and helping GI practices and health systems triage and treat the swelling numbers of patients seeking MASLD and MASH testing. LiverRight offers same-week video visits and accepts insurance. For more information, contact LiverRight. That's liver then R-I-G-H-T as if one word, at www.liverright.com.
Tawazun Health, your partner in global liver health innovation. At Tawazun Health, we specialize in providing small or large-scale access to FibroScan examinations for liver health-focused early detection, clinical trials, independent research, and collaborative projects with clinicians and FibroScan providers, now in over 30 countries around the globe. As industry-leading experts, we design and deliver high-quality FibroScan services because we know that accurate, high-quality, reliable data drives better outcomes. To learn about Tawazun Health or our sister lifestyle app, mylife365.me, click the Tawazun Health link on the Surfing MASH homepage. This conversation shares the second segment of our special roundtable, exploring the likely impact of the recent FDA approval of semaglutide for patients living with non-cirrhotic MASH.
The second conversation steps beyond the immediate issue of more education and more awareness, and it actually starts to ask, well, how are we going to manage all these patients? Because the patient flow should be considerable if patient education grows. Naim Alkhouri starts by talking about how hepatologists have to get more comfortable using GLP-1s. Zobair Younossi points out that even if all the related specialists began to treat, we still wouldn't have enough providers to deal with the flow of MASH patients that we can expect over the next few years. As a result, the group concludes, APPs are going to be pivotal going forward. There's a small debate about whether improving the economic incentives to doctors would help or whether there are just too many patients for that to matter much. However, we will need to see not only APPs, but also more efficient use of databases and AI if we're to make full and timely progress, given the tools that we now have to deal with.
You know, Roger, to follow up on what Scott said, that endocrinologists are not too comfortable staging liver disease and identifying MASH with F2, F3. Hepatologists are not comfortable prescribing GLP-1. And I think this is going to be the biggest impact for my colleagues is that, you know, you need to get over it and you need to be comfortable prescribing a GLP-1 and managing GI side effects is, you know, what we train to do in our fellowship in terms of managing nausea and diarrhea as GI providers. So, you know, if primary care physicians and endocrinologists are very comfortable managing GI side effects, we should be very comfortable. So I see this as a good thing. And there was a recent letter in Clinical Gastroenterology and Hepatology asking hepatologists, do you think GLP-1s are beneficial in MASH? And almost everyone said, of course, they're beneficial. But then when they said, do you prescribe GLP-1? Over 90% said, no, I don't. So this is one of the gaps we need to bridge. The other gap is, you know, we've done some studies, and Zobair did many studies looking at the disease burden. I can tell you, if you look at middle-aged adults in San Antonio, Texas, about 6% of them have MASH with F2 of 3. This is the entire, middle-aged adult population. So the estimates in the United States, they vary a lot, but we're talking about maybe 8 to 12 million people with MASH F2, F3 that qualify for semaglutide and resmetirom. And we do believe that we know about 325,000 of them. So this is really the gap. And this is, the size of the entire pie is so big. And I really don't even think that there would be much competition between semaglutide and resmetirom. I think it's going to be synergy to grow the pie for everyone. And when I say grow the pie, is really to help our patients, not to grow the pie for the pharma industry, but actually identify more at-risk patients and prevent progression to cirrhosis and all the complications. And I think this is really the biggest enemy that we're all fighting, is lack of awareness and not identifying the patients with at-risk MASH. And I think, the approval, expansion into Europe, all these new developments will help grow that pie and identify more patients.
Naim, you bring up a very good point. And in the same vein that we as gastroenterologists and hepatologists need to embrace use of GLP-1, and I am a big prescriber. I understand the prior authorization path, and I'm willing to manage the side effects, but not everyone is. I think one of the caveats that we risk is a huge uptake in GLP-1 without regard for identifying that advanced hepatic fibrosis patient. And so patients can get put on GLP-1 because they're seen to have MASLD or MASH or at risk. And all those patients with cirrhosis fall by the wayside with the thought that they're now on a GLP-1, everything's fine, and we miss the opportunity to actually screen for liver cancer, assess MELD scores over time, look for hepatic decompensation. So while there's a silver lining that we have, GLP-1s now approved, the risk is we generalize their use even more broadly at the indication that somebody has fatty liver without regard to underlying staging and assessment of cirrhosis. So we equally have to encourage primary care and endocrinologists to put the hat of a hepatologist. If we're going to prescribe GLP-1, then the converse should be, how can we empower them with the right tools and knowledge to ensure that we're not missing those patients with cirrhosis.
Manal, does that suggest that we might see increased focus on in-office scanning, transient elastography, the 2D shear wave and stuff like that?
I hope so. I hope that every stakeholder has access to the right tools, whether it's an in-office transient elastography or a referral pathway for MR elastography or easy access in a multidisciplinary care environment to a hepatologist who can size up a patient's risk. But prescribing GLP-1s in silo of understanding the underlying severity of liver disease would create a risk of missing those with well-compensated cirrhosis.
Okay, Scott's nodding because we do this on audio. I'll note that Scott is nodding. Zobair, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think I just want to remind, I'm going to show my age because I've been practicing for 30 some years. And there was a time where hepatologists used to use a drug called interferon, everyday injection for a whole year that caused terrible side effects. I remember, and we were comfortable. We were okay. So I think the care pathway in hepatology and gastroenterology has changed. Obviously, the numbers are much bigger here than it was for hepatitis C, believe it or not. 4 or 5 times. If you just look at MASH, it's at least 5 times more than hepatitis C. So, but then we had systems that we created to be able to actually treat lots of patients with hepatitis C. And I was at the Cleveland Clinic at the time, and we were treating hundreds of patients. I think now with APPs, especially GI APPs, because hepatologists cannot really take on MASH by themselves. So it has to be with our colleagues in gastroenterology and then with endocrinology and primary care, But most of these subspecialties will be there. APPs that will be learning how to actually prescribe the medication, stratify, prescribe the medication, manage the side effects, etc. I'm going back to what Manal said. I think it's really also this raising awareness is not just about treatment, but also about finding those patients who are at risk of all other complications of this disease, both liver complications. So yes, you can use a VCT, a transient elastography or MRE if you don't have it. I mean, there is enhanced liver fibrosis test that's already FDA approved and it's available, and that's a great test. I think people have to start getting more comfortable with the guidelines and algorithms that are out there that suggest how to use these non-invasive tests. But also it will encourage us to think about this disease not just being owned by gastroenterology and hepatology, that it's going to have to be owned by all of us, from endocrinology to primary care, cardiology. But to be honest with you, having I run the medicine service line here, it's very hard to actually get our colleagues in primary care to take on another disease for diabetics. I was just trying to get them to take back the patients who are stable diabetics back to their practice. Their practice is so incredibly busy that they don't have the time to really take on more. So we have to think about alternative practice pathways and how to make it easy for our colleagues in primary care and endocrinology and gastroenterology to make this happen, because the potential numbers are so much larger than before. And if you bring in more drugs, more and more NITs, you need to have sort of the knowledge that's updated, that next year you may have another mechanism, and then how you choose and which algorithm you're going to follow. It requires people to follow through with some sort of keeping the knowledge out there. So my hope is that we invest more and more in our frontline providers, the advanced practitioners that really can and already zoning a lot of the hepatology sort of maybe easy practices, so that the more complicated practices could come to a hepatologist like Manal, Naim, myself, and to endocrinologists like Scott. So I think we're keeping that will be important. The manpower issue will be important to manage.
That's a fantastic point, Zobair. Hey, Naim, paint our audience a picture of what you think that might look like on a day-to-day basis from a hepatology or an APP practice out, if you would. And then, Scott, I'm going to ask you the same question coming out of a non-hepatology practice.
Before I do that, I just want to, address one question, which is probably everyone is thinking, how are you going to utilize resmetirom versus semaglutide? How does the data compare? And I just want to give you my take on this. I think efficacy-wise, when you look at the MASH resolution, fibrosis improvement on histology, we can compare, apples to apples, because the duration of the study was 52 weeks versus 72 weeks. And, the patient populations were not exactly the same at baseline. We had a pre-screening strategy with Maestro-NASH, where patients needed to have, for example, liver stiffness above 8.5 kilopascal and a CAP score and MRI-PDFF. So we need to keep this in mind. And for me, I think fibrosis regression is probably the holy grail and the most important endpoint, at least in terms of accelerated approval. And in my mind, I think, they're pretty similar on the fibrosis endpoint. If you look at the delta from placebo, pretty much the same. We're talking about 11-12% with resmetirom versus 14.5% with semaglutide, but longer duration. So I think I just want to put that out there, that both drugs are effective, they're wonderful, but there is also room for improvement and maybe combination therapy. I think in terms of weight loss, of course, we see more weight loss with semaglutide, no doubt. On A1C also, it has more efficacy. We know resmetirom is weight neutral. It doesn't affect your A1C. But if you look at LDL cholesterol, you see actually better reduction with resmetirom. So I think these are the nuances we need to become more familiar with so we can practice personalized medicine. I also want to highlight a couple points when you look at the fibrosis endpoint. So actually within Essence, if you look at the supplementary tables, they looked at lean MASH and patients with BMI less than 27 specifically, and it didn't really work on fibrosis, So of course the sample size is small, we can debate this, but I just want to put it out there that maybe for lean MASH, semaglutide will not be my first choice. And there was a little bit of a drop in terms of the response on fibrosis in the F3 population compared to F2, and then also in diabetic patients. So I think, the reason why I say all of this is, again, to highlight that a personalized approach that emphasizes long-term follow-up and knowing that we're not going to just, put someone on a GLP-1 and forget about them and they're fine. This is a key message. And this is how we manage diabetes. I mean, GLP-1 is a wonderful drug for diabetes, but, Scott doesn't start someone on GLP-1 and say, good luck to you. It's been, good knowing you. You still monitor the A1C and you monitor for all the complications. And when needed, you add medications. And this is how I envision MASH moving forward. In terms of, the day-to-day clinical stuff, I think, our APPs and providers are going to feel more empowered now. And I think there will be more pressure also from patients to be on treatment. They're not going to take the old advice like, let's do a lifestyle intervention, come back in 6 months and we'll see what happens. And now, unfortunately, we're seeing more patients that have family members that develop MASH cirrhosis. And some of them need a transplant. Some of them develop serious complications. These are the patients that are, most motivated in my clinic to be on treatment. They see the writing on the wall. There is a genetic component to it. And I think, the knowledge is spreading among patients. We have many wonderful patient advocates also that are raising awareness. My take on this is there will be more decision-making and action happening in a MASH clinic. Hepatologists, historically speaking, they always said, this is boring. What do you guys do in the MASH clinic? You just tell them lose weight, come back. But now we have a lot to do, and we're going to have more in the near future.
Listening to you raise an interesting question. One of the things I've been in the back of my head as I've been listening to all of you is most hepatologists started on transplant, and transplant is kind of a heroic thing. You take somebody who's very sick and you really turn their life around very quickly. This is different. Is hepatology the right specialty to be thinking about what to do with early stage MASH patients? And if so, is that going to be the doctor, the APP, or are they going to wind up in multi-specialty metabolic practices of some kind? How might that work?
I think hepatology is a great place, irrespective of what stage a patient is in. The issue for all of us is capacity. Do we have the capacity to see every patient with MASLD and MASH, and particularly those with very mild disease? We really don't. And so where I could be of more service is for that patient who needs liver-directed pharmacotherapies specifically for at-risk MASH, or care because they have cirrhosis at potentially the expense of enriching a hepatology clinic with those that are closer to a liver-related outcome than those that are much farther removed from it. And so I think if we had, ample amounts of hepatologists, sure, we'd be happy to see any patient with liver disease, but it's a matter of capacity. And I think the same issue resonates for endocrinology and even for primary care. And so we're going to have very creative and innovative care strategies. We need to train more advanced practice providers. We need to train potentially more physicians with a dedicated interest in metabolic diseases and their multi-system complications. I don't know what the right answer or right approach is now, but at least for the time being, many of us in hepatology clinics are wanting to see that at-risk MASH or patient with more advanced liver disease. I can let Naim and Zobair speak for themselves, but I would say it's a matter of capacity.
I want to be provocative here, Manal, and say it's not a matter of capacity, it's a matter of the business model. If there was actually a financial incentive for doctors to take on more MASH patients and it was lucrative for the practice, I promise you that we will find the resources. The problem has been is that, there is no money to be made in an outpatient hepatology practice. GI practices survive on doing screening colonoscopies and procedures, and seeing patients in clinic is becoming less and less lucrative in the United States, because if there is money to be made, you will create the resources around it. And this is the sad reality. And I want to be provocative here because, this will actually advance the field and save lives. But how can we develop this outpatient hepatology business model that makes money? Because I promise you that there's many entrepreneurial people in the United States and there's many resources to be leveraged. But this is a question we struggle with on a daily basis. I can tell you, having worked in 3 outpatient hepatology practices, what saves us is really clinical trials and clinical research. There are practices that survive on endoscopy still, or a relationship with the transplant program where you get subsidized by the transplant program. This is really disheartening that again, seeing patients in the United States now is just not a viable business model by itself. And that's the sad reality.
I agree with you, Naim, but it is not actually unique to hepatology. That's the, pay model that we have in this country where the E&M sort of specialties, whether it's hepatology or from primary care or endocrinology, they're not getting paid the same as, and that requires a fundamental change in how we actually change the payment structure in this country, whether it's actually pay for performance or whatever it is that we structure. It is huge, a huge challenge, obviously, because if we have the model of care, then we will have enough primary care physicians that can actually have the time to see another patient. So I think that's a really important issue, but it is going to take at least another decade or more to really resolve this manpower issue in medicine in general. What I do think that's going to happen is that I want to make a point to your listeners, Roger. It's important to raise awareness about MASLD. It's important to say 38% of the general population have MASLD. And I've done a lot of this research myself. But it's also important to say that not all MASLD patients will develop. In fact, the majority of MASLD patients will not develop liver disease. It's only the small proportion of patients that have MASH. So it's important to know that, or to emphasize that those patients that have MASH are at risk for bad liver disease, so that we and this is where our technology can help us. I actually think that the power of AI and the power of sort of machine learning to help with risk stratification, so that this is not automatically, if we have systems in place in 5 years where your patient with MASLD are, immediately and efficiently identified and risk stratified, and only those patients who are really at risk with the current NITs or the new NITs, so that your accuracy for identifying a patient at risk is close to 100%, that you get those patients to the front line, and whatever that front line is. That's where we need actually more and more. That's going to be our challenge. Payment for providers will be a challenge, but the way I see technology going outside medicine, this is for our field of hepatology, this is going to be one of the biggest opportunities that we have to leverage the sort of machine learning and AI sort of technology to really enhance the risk stratification strategy, so out of this big pile of hay, we can find that small needle of a patient that's actually at risk. So we don't exaggerate the risk, but at the same time, we don't sort of diminish the risk and find really the patient that needs the care. And then we will have enough providers that probably could actually take care of this if we have sort of this level of APPs, all the subspecialties, with transplant hepatology being really at the top, where I would submit to you that the transplant hepatology is such a busy work for a lot of us that you really want to see the patient that needs you because they have a year or less to live, and you want to focus everything you have. You would want to share the rest of your patients with more, with earlier disease, with F2s or F3s, with your colleagues that have more time.
On behalf of the surfers, our guests, and our sponsors, Regeneron Pharmaceuticals, Liver Right, and Tawazun Health, thanks for joining us this week.
Please join us again next week. We may have another special roundtable on the resmetirom EMA decision, or this week's FDA guidance on NITs and clinical trials, or our regularly scheduled episode discussing what Roger and Louise each considered the major story of the first half of 2025.
And until next week, stay safe, surf on, and we'll see you again on Surfing the Tsunami Podcast. Bye-bye now.